It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you about this really challenging issue, I think, that's come from nowhere in the last few years or so. My own background, I was originally New Zealander, hence the funny accent. I've been here for nearly 30 years now. I trained in general surgery and I've been working with the Christian Medical Fellowship for the last 27 years. I started off in student ministry and I've been the CEO since about 2000. And we're interested in all these issues at the interface of Christianity and medicine. And CMF is made up of about 5,000 doctors and 1,000 medical students, and we've now got a nurses' work as well, with about 400 of those. So that's where I'm coming from. I want to start off by showing you a video which I think illustrates beautifully the change that's happened in our culture. And you'll see here some interviews with university students in America. And in this talk, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at this whole issue of transgender, not just from a biblical perspective, we'll come back to that at the end, but from a cultural, political, medical, legal perspective as well. But I want to show you this video to start.
In light of all the conversation about gender and identity, we began to wonder if there's even a difference between men and women anymore. We went to Seattle University to find out.
Aware of the conversation going on in Washington State right now around kind of gender identity, gender expression issues, and the ability to access facilities on those grounds?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's gender neutral bathrooms in like all the dorms and stuff like that.
I think that gender is fluid, so if you want to use a bathroom because that's a place and that's a space where you feel comfortable and safe in doing so, then I think that that's completely fine.
I think that if whoever you think you are, if you're male or female, then that's the bathroom you should go into.
I think if it doesn't really negatively affect anybody, then I think anyone should be able to choose what gender they choose to identify as.
People, no matter what their gender identification is, they should be allowed to use whatever restrooms they feel like they identify with.
Is there a difference in your mind between men and women?
No, yes. I mean,
Possibly.
In general, yes. But I don't know why I think that.
Socially, currently, yes, there is. There is no need for that difference to exist, scientifically and logically.
If you think that you're a male, if you think that you're a female, that matters more than the biological difference.
There's not much difference besides what society forces onto people.
And how do you know the difference between men and women?
By what people think they are. So you can't judge someone just on their looks.
I don't think there's any one way to really distinguish between a man or a woman, and I don't think it's necessary.
It's not always consistent. It has a high probability, 98% of the time I can get it right. There is some ambiguity.
I think, yeah, there are ways to tell, but then again, you can always be wrong.
What would you say I am?
Just judging off of your looks, I would say that you're a male.
I would probably assume a man, but then you never know.
A male.
Why would you say that?
Based on how I look at you.
Do you think that's a problem?
Yeah, probably.
Do you think the difference between men and women matters for any reason?
No, not really.
I think most sociologists agree that the concept of gender is more of a societal construct.
I do think it matters somewhat, yeah.
To me, no. I don't feel as if it matters to me because at the end of the day, the person is just a person.
no. I don't think it should matter.
And the differences on a social level are simply a product of a biased society.
Then is there a reason to have those labels, male or female?
I don't think so. I think that it's, again, a social construct of this binary that we're given at birth.
There is kind of a difference, but at the same time, if someone wants to identify as one or both or as nothing, I also find that completely okay. And
There may be nothing more self-evident in the natural universe than the fact that every animal species is divided into two halves, male and female. Yet the most intelligent of those species seems to be wrestling with whether male or female are actually real things. Have we discovered something new, Or have we become too clever for our own good?
Sometimes when I call a lady sir by accident, they get very offended.
Okay, it's good to see you finally laughing at the end of this, but at one level it's incredibly funny, and at another level it's incredibly tragic, because these are extremely intelligent university students who are being interviewed here. And what you're getting here is what we call transgender ideology. It's a whole new way of thinking that is sweeping around the Western world. The whole idea that sex is not something biological, but it's what you think you are that really matters. And that people are male or female purely because of they're the product of a biased society which has forced them to adopt certain roles. Now, this little diagram here was produced by Planned Parenthood, which is one of the major promoters of abortion throughout the world, and is in all sorts of trouble in the US at the moment. But it illustrates the point. And what Planned Parenthood is saying here is there are three different things. There's biological sex, first of all, and that's what's between your legs, they say. And then there's sexual orientation. So who are you erotically attracted to? Is it people of the same sex or the opposite sex? And that's all about your heart. And then there's gender identity, what you think you are, a man, a woman, or trans, or whatever. And so these three things, your heart, your brain, and what's between your legs, can move in completely different directions. So we can have any kind of combination of them. That's what we're being told. And we've reached the point now that transgender ideology is getting so entrenched in the corridors of power, and particularly in universities, that Germaine Greer, who many of us will remember as one of the leading lights of feminism, can go to Cardiff University in Britain and be no-platformed, in other words, not allowed to speak even, because she's judged as transphobic for saying that trans women, men who have changed into women, if you like, are not real women. So she gets she gets no platform. Or this Oxford teacher, Josh Sutcliffe, who was on the news recently, because there was a little a girl in his class who believed she was a boy, and he made the mistake of calling her a girl, and he initially lost his job over that issue. So this is a hugely important issue because it has ramifications even in law now. And yet on the other hand, we do have this situation where we have children or teenagers who are incredibly distressed because they genuinely believe that they are in the wrong body. And here you've got a picture of a little boy, biologically, who doesn't want to grow up and grow a beard and is incredibly distressed about this whole thing. And what I want you to grasp, if you grasp nothing else today, what we need to grasp is that we're dealing with two different issues. First of all, this transgender ideology. This is a way of thinking, a false belief system, I put it to you, that's attempting to shape morality, law and society. And the way that we must approach that is by understanding it and refuting it. It's a false ideology, a false idea that has to be captured and proved wrong. But on the other hand, we have a real and distressing medical condition now called gender dysphoria, which needs to be met with compassion and understanding. And as Christians, we have to, on the one hand, be prophetic, people who are speaking the truth into a society which has embraced falsehood and lies, but on the other, showing the love of Christ in compassion to people who are suffering and really are greatly distressed. And the trick is being able to separate those two responses. Now, is there a difference between little boys and little girls? Why is it that little girls generally play with dolls and boys with cars and so on, although obviously there's some overlap? And there are differences in boys and girls biologically, we'll come back to that, but also in the way that the brains work as well as a result of the chromosomal and hormonal influences on the brain. And so women generally score higher on emotional recognition tests, social sensitivity, language ability. There are some things that girls and women are better at, and there are some things that boys are better at. They score higher on maths and mechanical subjects, better at map reading. Have you ever had a fight in the car over map reading? Of course, we don't use maps anymore, do we? And that's a good thing. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't men who are emotionally sensitive. It doesn't mean that there aren't men who can find a pint of milk in the fridge. Because some men can. And it doesn't mean that there aren't women who can become professors of particle physics, because there are women who do. But there are differences in the way that men's and women's brains operate. Now, this is one way it's been illustrated, that there are parts of the brain that function or develop more strongly in men and women, but being more serious, when we look at the neural connections that there are in the brain, we find that there are a different pattern in men and women. So there are much more front to back, what we call parasagittal connections in men, and much more cross connections in women, which is, people say, is why women are perhaps much better at multitasking than men are at. And yet, men and women are not two distinct populations in terms of giftedness and personality. There's a huge amount of overlap. There are, under the Myers-Briggs scheme, there are 16 different personality types in the world, and men and women identify with all of them. And so there's an overlap between men and women, but we mustn't then get fooled into thinking that these are two indistinguishable categories and that there's no difference between men and women. And what's happened is that when I was a young man, we said that some men were more effeminate, some women were more butch, that there were men who liked to carry out activities that generally women were more enamoured of, and in the same way there were women who liked to play contact sports and drive motorbikes and all the rest. And that was a perfectly normal part of the spectrum of men and women, the amazing diversity that we all recognise. And so in the old days we used to say, with a young girl who liked to play contact sports and climb trees, we'd just say, well, she's a tomboy. But we wouldn't say that she's really a boy in a girl's body. And that's the change that we're seeing. And over the last few years, we've seen a huge explosion in people who are gender conflicted or gender confused being referred to medical clinics for a change of gender. And here's one of the highlights from the Guardian. And this is a graph showing the referrals just over the year from 2009 up to 2017. And you can see there's a huge increase in both boys and girls, but interestingly, it's girls that are wanting to do this in much higher numbers now. And that's something completely new, because transgender 20 years ago, it was mainly boys, not girls. What sort of age groups? Well, it's mainly the teenage group, the 13 to 17, who are having these conflicts. But you can see there are people being referred to Tavistock who go right down to the age of 3 for treatment. And recently there's a new phenomenon being recognised called rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD. And someone at Brown's University, a prestigious university in the States, wrote a scientific paper about this. And particularly they were concerned about clusters of young women, teenage girls, who believed that they were boys and wanted to change. And that they noticed that they tended to be mainly they're mainly female, these people. They were in groups, often even in the same class, and they noticed that also there'd been a huge influence from social media, particularly YouTube videos and celebrity culture as well. And so this paper was published, and then the transgender lobby complained that it was being discriminatory and wrong, and they had to take it actually off the website. And more recently, the Equalities Minister in the UK, this is Penny Mordaunt, she has now ordered an inquiry into the massive spike in transgender referrals, particularly from girls. So that's where we're at the moment. Now, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. It all started, we'll tell you as doctors that when I was training 30 or 40 years ago, then transgender was a recognised medical phenomenon. We had people coming in. But it's been a massive cultural explosion in the last few years, just going back about 5 years. And Time magazine talked about the transgender tipping point. And that the game changer in this whole area was Caitlyn Jenner, who's pictured here on the left. Now, those of us who were teenagers or in our 20s in the 1970s will remember Bruce Jenner, who won a gold medal in decathlon at the Olympics for the US. And Bruce is now Caitlyn. He's also a member of the Kardashian family, which means he's got celebrity status. And when Bruce changed to become Caitlyn and took hormones to grow breasts and so on, and appeared on Vanity Fair magazine, suddenly it hit the mainstream. And it's largely through celebrity culture that we've seen this come in. So The Danish Girl, you might have seen the film starring Eddie Redmayne about a transsexual from many years back in Denmark. And it got to the point, people were saying, well, it's not just male, female and trans, but there are lots of different genders. And Facebook tried to keep up with this by giving everyone the option to choose their gender. They got up to 71 different genders. And then they decided this is getting a bit out of control. Better just be perhaps man, woman or other. And you might ask what those are, and here are the symbols for some of them. And most of these I don't think you'll recognise at all, but you'll see up in the top left-hand corner there, male and female, and then by gender beside them there's a whole lot of others as well. And this article is claiming that there are an infinite variety of genders in the world and that everybody has a different gender. So this is the direction that we're going. And of course it's not surprising that that whole kind of thinking is in the church. So here's a non-binary pastor in Brighton. And then the church has been in large part confused about how to respond to this issue as well. So we had the Church of England voting overwhelmingly in favour of welcoming transgender people, not just being compassionate and welcoming and kind to transgender people, but actually affirming their beliefs to some extent as well. And Justin Welby got into quite a bit of trouble when he tried to explain his views on it. And this open letter to Premier Radio said, Justin Welby, we're looking for you to give a stronger lead on this whole issue. So we've had this massive cultural change and people don't know how to respond to it. And even in church, people aren't well thought through on it. Number of book recommendations. If you're a serious reader, this is one of the very best by Gabriel Kubi, Global Sexual Revolution, tracing the cultural and political background to it. But let's step back a bit and look at the culture. Where did transgender come from? Transgender ideology we're talking about. And there were three main roots for it. First of all, radical feminism, which was all about throwing off the male yoke and liberating women, not just the totally right and appropriate things of the vote and the women in the workforce and all of that, but the whole idea that women were oppressed throughout history by this male oligarchy, radical feminism. Gnosticism is the idea that the inner authentic us is something different than the external person or the body. And then queer theory, the idea that you heard expressed by these university students who had been studying at a university, that gender categories are just social constructions and they're nothing to do with our biology. So who were some of the main voices in this? Well, Simone de Beauvoir, who was a leading academic feminist, actually married to Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher as well. And she had made this timeless statement, one's not born but rather becomes a woman. So the idea is that if a woman is something that you become, that you're not born as, then perhaps it's something that can change throughout individuals, and that maybe a disconnection between biology and what we think or are. And it was really Judith Butler, in her book Gender Trouble, that laid the intellectual framework for transgenderism. And queer theory, which you can now study at university, it's an academic discipline, it came out of radical feminism, and it had the aim of rupturing what is called the man-woman binary, the idea that men and women are two distinct things. You see the students in that video saying, well, there's no difference between men and women anymore. And the teaching of queer theory was that woman and man are myths, they're social constructs. Now, that's the cultural background, or the academic background to it, if you like. How's this affected the law? Well, in 2004 in the UK, the Gender Recognition Act came into being, and this allowed transgender people to be legally recognised in their chosen gender, but they had to jump through a whole series of hoops first. They had to be at least 18 years old, they had to have lived in their chosen gender for at least 2 years with cross-dressing and so on. They had to have a medical certificate, and they had to go before a panel to get a gender recognition certificate. And that was what you had to do. But the move now is to make this much easier, and this came out of a committee back in 2015, the Transgender Equality Report from the Women and Equalities Committee. And what they wanted to do was to lower the age from 18 to 16 to 17 and give puberty blockers to stop puberty coming on in younger children, and cross-sex hormones for teenagers. But things then moved very quickly, even more radically. So this is just 2 or 3 years change. Justine Greening came along as the Secretary of State for Education, Women and Equalities. So some very, very powerful portfolios she had. And she herself, Conservative MP, a lesbian who'd come out as that. And her whole idea was that let's sweep away everything, even any age limit at all, any medical certificates, let's demedicalise it completely and just make it purely on the basis of what people think they are, on self-identification. And we were coming up to Christmas last year, and it looked like the law was going to change very, very quickly to allow this. And then a number of things happened. The first thing was that an MP by the name of David Davis, not the Brexit guy, but the Welsh chap, held a meeting in Parliament where he got together a whole lot of different groups who were very concerned about the rise of transgender ideology. And as you'd expect, there were Christians there, but also a number of other groups who were equally concerned. One group were a group of women who were running women's refuges, and they were very concerned about protecting safe spaces for women who had been abused, and they were worried about trans women, women who were biologically male coming into those spaces. And then there was a group called Transgender Trend, and that was made up of a whole lot of parents of children who were gender conflicted. And they were worried about the breakup of their families and how to handle their children, and they were concerned about this transgender ideology. There was also a therapist from Bath University who had dealt with people who'd had transgender therapy and then wanted to change back again, were very unhappy having had surgery or hormones and wanted to change back, and he wanted to do some research on this, and he was told by his university that it was not politically correct to do the research, and he was stopped. And that there was a trans woman on the panel as well who said, look, this is much more a belief system than anything real. And so suddenly we saw this incredible escalation, speed of change, and it looked like the law was all going to change last year, and then suddenly there was resistance up against it. And you probably didn't hear this or read this headline because it came out on Christmas Day in the Daily Mail last year, but rethink over new law. And then all of a sudden, Justine Greening had a spat with Theresa May. She left her role, and Pink News, who are backing LGBT ideas, were terribly upset about this, and they saw this as a lost opportunity. And with the departure of Justin Greening, the whole thing lost momentum. Now, what we have seen is that in Scotland there has been a consultation which has asked the public what they think of bringing in this new law to make it possible just to change by self-identification without having to see doctors or panels or even be 18 or whatever. And that consultation is now finished, and we're waiting for the legislation to come, and it will come fairly soon. And there's been a similar consultation in Britain, and again we're waiting for the legislation to come. So the issue is still very live. It's been slowed down slightly in the move forward, but it's still huge. So there we have the cultural background, we've looked at the legal background and what Parliament's doing. And let's look at what's happening in the world of medicine. Now, up until a few years ago, when I was a medical student, right up until the year 2013, this condition was known as gender identity disorder. In other words, the way we thought about it was that these were people who had a false belief that they were the other sex. But what's happened in the last few years in medicine is that there's been a sea change in thinking. The name's been changed from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. And it's only thought to be a problem if the person's unhappy, if they've got inner conflict. Otherwise, it's just, transsexuality has just seemed to be a kind of normal variant. And a few years ago, we produced this article, CMF File series, written by Andrew Sims, who was a member of the Christian Medical Fellowship, evangelical Christian, and was also president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And he wrote this article called Gender Identity Disorder, in which he looked at it scientifically and biblically. Now, we couldn't publish this anymore. We had to rewrite this because of the change in the medical thinking about this. So this new term of gender dysphoria is now the one that's used. And we had to rewrite it in the new environment. And if you go to the Royal College of Psychiatrists website, you'll find this document, Good Practice Guidelines for the Assessment and Treatment of Adults with Gender Dysphoria. You can see the date there is 2013, so all very, very recent. And this is the kind of things it's got in it, so hormonal treatment, family support, hair treatment, storage of eggs and sperm and so on for people who want to change. And you can see it's been backed by every major medical body in the country. So not just Parliament, not just the law, but much of the medical profession also has just in the last few years changed its view on this subject. And I'd say that change is driven largely by ideology rather than being based on any real evidence. So suddenly, as Christian doctors, we find ourselves in a very in a small minority of people who are saying, hang on, what's the evidence for this change of belief? And in fact, if you go to the General Medical Council website, the regulatory body which issues licenses to doctors so they can practice, there's pages and pages and pages now on transgender and what you must do and how you must act and so on. And we're seeing an increasing number of doctors and nurses who are ringing up worried about losing their jobs because they won't go along with the new ideology. So it's not just in universities and schools. Now, I mentioned the Portman Clinic already. This is the clinic where people go for therapy, and you saw the graphs, and these are the numbers. You can see how they've gone up hugely. So doubling over the course of a year, children under 10 and even children as young as 3 who are going to these clinics. And what happens at these clinics? Well, first of all, people, these kids will adopt a transgender identity. So they'll say, well, no, I'm not a boy or a girl, I'm the other. And then they're given puberty blockers to stop the changes of puberty coming on. And then they're given sex hormones of the opposite sex to change their bodies into, to develop the secondary sex characteristics, development of breasts and body hair distribution and so on. And then ultimately some of them will also go on to have gender reassignment surgery. So for women that means that have their breasts removed and have external genitalia functioned and changed surgically. Of course, nothing changes inside. There's still XX chromosomes or XY, but a whole lot of other changes have been affected by surgery and by hormones. So what is this condition? And this is the key question here. Remember, right at the beginning I said there are two issues. One of them is a way of thinking, transgender ideology. One of them is a real but distressing medical condition. And we need to think first about our definitions and terms. So biological sex is determined by chromosomes, external genitalia and so on, but gender is much more the psychological, social and cultural aspects of being male or female. And gender identity is what you think you are, what you feel you are, and there can be an incongruence or conflict between the biology and what you think you are. Now biologically, there are just two sexes, male or female. Males have XY chromosomes, females have XX. This leads them to produce certain hormones which develop secondary sex characteristics. The gonads, testes or ovaries, the genitals, penis or vagina, and then the brain will develop as well in response to the hormones that are produced. So it's strictly biological, if you like. But gender dysphoria is when people will feel, or what we call gender identity disorder, is when people feel that there's a conflict between what their biology says they are and what they actually believe they are. Now, before we go on to look at that in more detail, we have to recognise that there is such a condition called intersex. And if you understand the difference between intersex and transgender, then you will be in a better position than most MPs and most people in authority on this issue, but it's very simple to understand. People who are intersex have something wrong biologically. It might be something wrong with their chromosomes. So instead of being XX or XY, they're XXY or XYY or XO. Or it might be that they've got something wrong with their hormones. And there are a whole variety of different medical conditions which are categorized as intersex. Intersex is completely different from transgender, where biologically, from chromosomes to hormones to genitalia to everything, a person is either male or they're either female. In intersex, which is a real medical condition, there is actually some biological difference. Now, what causes gender dysphoria? Well, we don't really know. There are different theories. Some people think it's related to biology. Some people think it's related to the way people are brought up. It's incompletely understood, but not unlike sexual orientation, it's not something that a person necessarily chooses. They just find that they have these feelings or thoughts about themselves. So it's a complex product, if you like, of genetics and upbringing and choice. Gender dysphoria is actually incredibly rare, or at least it used to be. And you can see the figures there, fewer than 1 in 10,000 boys, fewer than 30,000 girls. But what we're seeing now is a new phenomenon of what we call contagion, whereas social media, celebrity culture and so on, and a change in thinking have had a huge difference on the number of people who are identifying as transgender. Transgender is associated with a whole degree of mental health problems. There's no one who disputes this. The medical literature is absolutely clear on this. People will argue about what the reason for that is, but we know that people with gender dysphoria have a much higher incidence of anxiety, of depression, of suicidality and so on. And in fact, if you have had transgender surgery, then you are 19 times more likely to die of suicide than someone in the normal population. 19 times. And suicide attempts among trans men and trans women are roughly 10 times those found in the overall population. we now know that there is a link also between gender dysphoria and autism. Now, this doesn't mean that all transgender children are autistic, or all autistic children have transgender or whatever. It just means that there's an association, so it's more likely if you have one that you will have the other as well. What's the natural history of it? Well, what's very interesting is that people do change over time. So of people who turn up as adults at a clinic thinking they are the opposite gender, then half of them, 50%, will never finish treatment. In other words, they'll go back and live in accordance with their birth gender. Although with psychological treatment alone, it's often not possible to bring about a change. So in other words, for many people with gender dysphoria, it's a lifelong conflict that they will have to deal with. And for a significant percentage, 25% of them, the surgery is not positive. In other words, it doesn't resolve the problems, and then they're wanting to go back again. And some would say the figure is a lot higher than that this 25% is based on very small samples, only followed up for a short period of time. And if you follow people up a lot longer, then you see higher, different results than that. And so we're now seeing this phenomenon of sex change regret, where people are wanting to detransition and go back. And this is the very thing that the Bath professor was wanting to research and was told it was politically incorrect. So that's adults. What about kids? Well, it's not unlike a homosexuality in this sense, that it's not at all uncommon for children when they're growing up to be erotically attracted, sexually attracted to people of the same sex. That's not unusual. But for the vast majority of children growing up through the teenage years, it's a passing phase, if you like. And we see exactly the same thing in gender dysphoria. So it's not uncommon that little boys or little girls will think, well, I'm really more like a boy or a girl, I'm not like I am biologically. But in the vast majority, these feelings do not persist. And in fact, the bottom line figure you've got there is that 80 to 95% of children, so these are kids around the age of 8 to 12 or so, who are presenting with gender dysphoria, they will not progress on to become transgender, but will then in time identify with their birth sex. And that in itself is a hugely important reason why they should not be railroaded through these clinics, which is sadly what's happening. There's also quite an overlap too between what we call homoerotic attraction, homosexuality if you like, and gender dysphoria, particularly among girls. So this is the fundamental question that we're looking at. What is gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder? Is it just a normal variant, which is what we're being told today, or is it actually a form of what we call in medicine body dysmorphia, where a person has a false belief about their body? And I think the best way of understanding this is to think about the condition of anorexia nervosa. So you've got a young person, usually a woman but not always, who believes that she's fat and overweight, and so she is dieting. She's very distressed about her body, and it can be even life-threatening when these kids will die to the extent that they put their lives in danger. A condition called anorexia nervosa. Now, when we think about anorexia nervosa, we don't, in approaching these folk, think, well, this is just a normal variant, and we should help them diet and perhaps even offer them liposuction as well. Do we? No, we say this person has a belief about their body which is not actually correct. And if we go along with it and affirm it, we can do a lot of damage. And that's always the approach that we used to take to gender dysphoria, but has now changed. And I'm suggesting to you that the change should not have taken place. So this is the key question we have to grapple with. Is a person with gender conflict, gender disorder, really a man in a woman's body, or vice versa? Or are they just a woman with a false belief that they are a man? And you can see where I'm coming from in this. I think it's the second, and that there's great danger in going along with it and affirming it. And so, of course, what you believe, how you answer that question, will determine how you then approach the problem. Well, what do you do when there's incongruence or mismatch between the body and the identity? Do you change the body to conform to the gender identity through hormones and surgery? And that's the direction the whole society is going now. Or do you alter the identity? Do you help the person be reconciled to their body through counselling and psychotherapy? Well, that's what we used to do, and that's what I say we should still be actually doing. But recognising that for some people it will be a lifelong struggle in a fallen world. So there's a bit of an overview. We looked at the culture, the law, medicine, politics, parliament, and so on, and the various clinical approaches to it. So let's think about it from a Christian point of view at this point. And we recognise that as Christians we are created in the image of God, but we live in a fallen world where sin has affected everything from our relationships to the planet itself. And we look to God through Christ's intervention, his death and resurrection, to be saved, to turn through repentance and faith, and to be remade as new creatures. And then we look forward beyond death to a future hope and a new heaven and a new earth. That's the Christian worldview, if you like. And just applying to that, creation. So God created human beings in his own image. And we're told in Genesis 1:27 that he made them male and female. That was the way God did it. So the Bible is unashamedly binary. It recognises that there are two sexes, biologically, culturally, and so on. And that, of course, is the basis of marriage. Genesis 2:24 and Ephesians 5:32, where a man and a woman who are biologically complementary come together to form a union. And that's a metaphor of Christ and his relationship with the church. And of course, Jesus was gendered. Jesus had XY chromosomes and a male body. So the Bible is unashamedly binary. And this is why you get scriptures like this in the Old Testament about cross-dressing or damaging one's body. And I'd say as a general surgeon, and I worked with a surgeon in New Zealand when I was training, who in his private practice was doing transgender surgery. I never helped him or participated in that, and it was interesting to me that he eventually stopped doing it, and I asked him why, and he said, well, after 20 years dealing with these poor people, I came to the conclusion that I hadn't met one of them who I would have said was psychologically normal. And that's why I stopped doing it, because I believed that the problem was actually not in their biology, but in their minds. Okay, I'll leave that with you. But as a surgeon, I believe that to do transgender surgery, to change people's external genitalia from one form to the other, is actually a form of emasculation or abuse. And yet we recognise that we live in a fallen world, and in a fallen world it shouldn't surprise us in the least that the fall has affected even our biology. That's why we have intersex. This is, I believe, also why we have transgender. It's why we have homoerotic attraction as well. It's not the way it was meant to be, but it is nonetheless a reality, and all of us are fallen creatures who are marred in some way and flawed masterpieces in some way. And I think it's very interesting the way Jesus talked about those who were born that way, eunuchs who were born that way. Eunuchs were people of no determinate sex. It was difficult to tell whether they were male or female or whatever. Eunuchs who were born that way, and I think there he's probably talking about intersex. There are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by others, perhaps through surgery or through the way that they've been handled or whatever. And then there are those who choose to live as eunuchs in celibacy. And it's interesting in Isaiah, when the prophet is looking forward to the new heaven and the new earth, and he says, let no eunuch complain, I'm only a dry tree. To the eunuchs I will give my temple with its walls, a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name that will endure forever. So it's a reminder of this fact that everything is going to be put right in the new heaven and the new earth. And we have to remind ourselves as Christians that we are new creations, that we are called to live new lifestyles, that we're turned to turn away from deception, to put on good behaviours and put off wrong behaviours, and also to bear one another's burdens in the difficulties. So when we're looking at this whole issue, I think we need to look at it first through the eyes of creation, to recognise that the Bible is unashamedly binary, that there are real differences between males and females, but appreciate too that we live in a fallen world, that we're all sinners, that we're all affected by sin, that transgender and intersex should not surprise us, that full healing might not be possible in this world, that the personal experience of transgender can be incredibly painful and difficult, and that churches, as well as being clear on the ideology, need to be welcoming and redemptive communities. So there we are. On the one hand, we don't capitulate to the kind of thinking that you saw beautifully illustrated in that video at the beginning, and we must grasp the opportunities that transgender presents for the gospel. Now, I've thrown a huge amount of stuff for you. We've got, I think, about 10 minutes left, haven't we, for questions. And but here I'll come back to the same point again. If you take nothing else away from this, take away this, that we're dealing with two different issues here. One is a way of thinking which is unbiblical, deceived, false, and it's sweeping through the corridors of power in our country, in Parliament, in the law courts, in the worlds of medicine, in the worlds of art, media, entertainment. And it's an idea that has to be combated. And then on the other hand, we've got a group of people who are very deeply distressed with a real medical condition who need to be treated with great compassion. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. We'll open up to questions in a moment, but I often think, Peter, if the Lord worked as he did in Corinth, would we be ready to welcome those people into our churches? Because that's for some of you, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And all of us are flawed masterpieces, aren't
Absolutely.
we? We're made in the image of God, but we all have challenges. Just on literature, there are a few books on the bookstall. If you want a simple introduction to this, I think Vaughan Roberts' Transgender is excellent. I haven't read this one, A Conversation Guide for Parents and Pastors, but this looks very good on a quick flick. And I've got some handouts. So there's an article here from our journal called Gender and Social Change, just one sheet of A4, and there's enough here. You can pass those around, there's enough there for everybody. And then if you want to go into it in more detail, there's a CMF file here as well.
If we pass these around and perhaps take one per family, and if there's spares, we can put them at the back and then you can take more.
So those are the ones there.
Yeah.
I think the best book on this issue really is this one on the right here. We haven't got any today, but you can, I think Mike has a copy.
Yeah.
But you can buy it on Amazon. Ryan Anderson, he's an American. When Harry Became Sally, I think this is absolutely the best book on this issue to read. Very good.
If anybody wants to look at it, it's here at the front. And also, Gabrielle Kubi's book, which, as Peter said, from my own reading of it, is one of those books everybody should read, but it's the circumstances of why we have to read it really is very, very searching.